大家好，欢迎收看这期的公子视频，我是公子沈。那这期我跟大家分享一段非常精彩的辩论访谈，两位嘉宾，一位是美国保守派的政治新星，这次总统大选共和党的候选人之一，印度裔的拉瓦斯瓦米，他现在在网络上面的声量非常大，虽然他已经退选了，但是他有巨大的号召力，特别在年轻一代。那另外一位是曾经的美国驻联合国大使，也是曾经川普时期的白宫国家安全顾问 Bolton。 他们两人在这次的辩论当中，对乌克兰问题、中国问题涉及到了这个国家安全的领域进行了辩论。那我这当中选取了跟中国有关的部分，这其中很重要的就是美国到底如何的，或者说会不会在中国入侵台湾的时候出兵保护台湾。其实整场辩论关于这个国家安全的问题，他们的焦点是美国到底应不应该充当世界警察。就这个问题呢，我过去也跟大家讲过，未来也会继续的跟大家做分析。不过这一期节目我们静下心来看看在美国都有重量级身份的两位，他们是如何看待的。我把整场辩论当中关于中国的部分翻译出来跟大家分享。
What would you advise the president to do in this moment, bearing in mind the rising challenge that China is posing to the Philippines and Taiwan, and to Mr. Ramaswamy's point, the relocation of a lot of US Navy assets to the Middle East? And then as a final point there, I'm the president, I'm saying I'm concerned about with our situation in the Red Sea, certainly guarding against the Houthi threat and the Iranian threat. Are we going through our missile defense systems, SM-6, whatever you want to call them, with a Middle Eastern threat and opening the door for Xi Jinping potentially 3 years from now to be more able to invade Taiwan? Ambassador.
Well, the dominant presence in the world today is a growing China-Russia axis with its outriders like North Korea, Iran, Syria, Belarus, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. This axis has nothing to do with the United States. This axis has been forming for 15 years, despite multiple efforts by the United States to bring Russia to the West, unsuccessfully. The fact is that the unwillingness to confront the threats that we've seen effectively that led to repeated Russian aggression in Ukraine, and the threat that China now poses along its Indo-Pacific periphery is a clear product of this moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union when the United States took its eye off the ball. So the first thing I would say to the president is we need to take American defense expenditures, which are roughly 3% of GDP right now, and return them to Reagan-era level defense expenditures of between 5 and 6%.
Should we be using force alongside the Israelis against Iran in the coming days? And if so, what targets?
Personally, I think Joe Biden has made yet another mistake. He's made a series of mistakes in handling the Iranian threat, which is what this war in the Middle East is about. I think I would recommend to the president that he recommend to the Israelis that they destroy the Iranian nuclear weapons program once and for all, and I would help them do it.
I think we both share a view that it would be a bad thing for the United States and our long-run interests if China were to annex Taiwan anytime in the foreseeable future. I think that would be a foreign policy disaster for the United States. But where we disagree is that China is in a stronger position to do so when, number one, Russia is actually in China's camp in the Russia-China military alliance, and number two, when the United States is actually stretched thin with other wars that don't directly relate to the United States' interests as much as the one in the South China Sea would. The fact of the matter is, the reason we're delayed on many of those shipments to Taiwan is precisely because of other wars, particularly the Ukraine war that we're involved in. The reason that we moved a carrier strike group out of the Asia-Pacific region, leaving us for the first time in the last 25 years without a carrier strike group in the Pacific region, is precisely because of the conflicts in the Middle East. So we have to focus on the actual threat that we face, and that is staving off aggression from communist China. And I reject the premise that China somehow deals by way of analogy, that if they're going to allow them to take a part of Ukraine, then we get to take part of Taiwan because we have the moral authority to do it. China doesn't reason based on moral authority. They reason based on hard power. And our hard power with respect to China is weaker when we're involved in other foreign conflicts that don't advance our interests.
All right, it's 2028, 2030. China is moving, blood banks, etc. It's about to invade Taiwan. Should we intervene with our full force to prevent that invasion or at least obstruct it?
Well, if we got to that point, it would show our policy had fundamentally failed. But it is clear that if China breaks through the first island chain at any point, that it would mean the collapse of our alliance systems all over the Indo-Pacific. What we need to show to Beijing is not about moral authority. It's precisely about hard power. Russia used hard power in Ukraine twice, and it's getting away with it. And I think it leads the Chinese to conclude they can do the same, whether it's on Taiwan or their continued advances in the South China Sea or in the land borders in Asia. I think you prevent this by building up not tanks and land-based weapons for Taiwan, because I don't think the Chinese ultimately are going to invade. I think they're going to create a political pretext and try and throw a blockade around China. We're talking about two entirely different sets of weapon systems. And to the extent there's any strain at all, you need to increase the defense budget. That's what I said at the very beginning.
But what about if we're at that point? I mean, if we're at the juncture of force.
Yeah. If we have done what we can to put Taiwan in a position to defend itself and the Chinese do attack, whether through blockade or invasion, yes, I think we have to come to Taiwan's defense.
So what should we be doing? I agree with Ambassador Bolton that if 4 years from now we're in a position where Taiwan is either being forcibly or indirectly annexed by China, that will be evidence of a disaster in our own policies. We should actually be strengthening our alliance with countries like India. And I don't say that because of, obvious reasons. Some people ask me that. But I say it because actually China gets a good portion of its oil supplies and other supplies through the Indian Ocean, through the Andaman Sea, that if they know that India's on side with the United States to be able to block the Andaman Sea under those conditions, if we know that we have appropriately deterred action, turned Taiwan into a porcupine, arming that island with the ability to deter Chinese aggression, that's what a successful strategy looks like. But we are in a weaker, not stronger position to do it when we're also funding wars in Ukraine without clearly directed or realistic war aims to win, when we're drawn into other conflicts in other parts of the world.
28, 2030, the Chinese are going in. Should we fight to defend Taiwan?
I think that right now, first of all, 2024, looking forward, we should do everything we can to deter that from happening. And under 2028, we should look at what best advances American interests, but I think it would be a disaster for Taiwan to be annexed by China. We'd obviously look at the conditions of that.
Thank you for that answer.
I believe the right way to actually get serious about declaring economic independence from China requires not just onshoring to the United States, but actually requires expanding our trading relationships with our allies. South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, India. You could talk about South America in this context where that becomes relevant. And that's different from those whose economic policy is focused on protecting American manufacturers from the effects of foreign price competition. So that's an internal debate to the America First, but I do think in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years is going to become an important dividing line is our seriousness about declaring independence from China so much so that we're willing to expand our relationships with other allies? I believe the answer to that question should be yes from an economic perspective. But if your principal goal is to actually protect American manufacturers from the economic effects of foreign price competition, you're necessarily delaying the timeline needed to declare independence from China. So to your question, not relating only to South America, but even our other allies around the Asia Pacific, I think that if we're serious about decoupling from China and the pharmaceutical supply chain and our military industrial base, that will require more, not less, trade with those allies. And the way that we actually make American manufacturers more competitive isn't by protecting them from the effects of that trade, but instead by dismantling the regulatory state, another species of the deep state that actually shackles the American economy. That, I think, is the path forward.
Ambassador.
Well, I think we have been asleep at the switch on China for a long time. And I think that we have failed to protect our own country and many others from Chinese theft of intellectual property. which they've been extremely successful at, and we've allowed them through the Belt and Road Initiative and a number of other approaches, including outright corruption, to make extraordinary gains, not just in Latin America, but in Africa and South Asia. So we come at this at a very perilous point because we've been asleep for so long under this illusion that China would be a responsible stakeholder in international affairs that was engaged in a peaceful rise, none of which was true. And the fact is we need to do more to remove Chinese influence in places where it's gained considerable strength, not least of which is Venezuela, where between Russia and China, they have been able to prop up the Chavez-Maduro regime in ways that are very harmful across Latin America. What this means more than anything else is that Americans have to pay more attention to foreign policy. You can't decree a policy if people don't know what's going on, and you have to be committed to a forward strategy around the world and not say our only problem is China in East Asia.
One is your goal just to nakedly raise tariffs to protect American manufacturers from the effects of foreign price competition? No, I think the way we protect American manufacturers is dismantle the regulatory state, including a lot of the internationalism through the climate change regulations and otherwise that are shackling American industry vis-a-vis China or other countries to which those same restraints don't apply. I think it is fair game for the United States to say, if you're going to effectively apply a tariff to us, we're going to at least level the playing field. The right outcome of that can usually be both countries getting rid of those restraints altogether. And I think that's a good thing. But we aren't really engaging in free trade. That's a myth if the other side is engaging in mercantilism. That was the mistake we made with China. By the way, with the bipartisan consensus in both parties dating back to the 1990s, we thought we could somehow use capitalism as a vector to spread democracy to China. And I don't know if you were in the room when that happened either, but that has been, I think, a miserable failure where we thought we could export Big Macs and Happy Meals and somehow that was going to spread democracy to China. The truth is we thought we could use our money, our investment to get them to be more like us. They used access to their market, in some ways our money, to get us to be more like them. And so when it's not an even playing field, when the other side is engaging in state-sponsored capitalism in air quotes, which is really just old world mercantilism, then no, we should not be pretending like they're a free trading partner and say that we don't do tariffs in the US. But if both sides are willing to say that we actually don't want restraints or favoritism on either side, and we actually want a level playing field to compete, I think the use of the threat of tariffs as a lever to drive change on the other side is smart, intelligent, and necessary. And that is something I would support.
Ambassador.
Well, Trump doesn't understand tariffs, which makes a coherent discussion of what he's trying to do almost impossible. But I can tell you what I recommended when I was in the White House is that I wouldn't use tariffs, but I would say that I would pass legislation that said that it would be illegal to import any Chinese manufactured goods or services that were based in whole or in part on stolen American technology. And the argument used against that within the administration was, well, that's almost all of it. It would mean no trade with China at all, which shows that fundamentally we have the capacity to do a lot of harm to China because of the way it conducts trade, the way it performs in the World Trade Organization, that we just haven't taken advantage of. It's the Chinese that took advantage in the WTO of the ability to declare yourself a developing country and get more favorable terms on some trade agreements, which is outrageous given China's economic strength. The answer to that, I thought, was declare the United States a developing country and then see what happens.
Whether or not the United States, and the way I read it, actually at its core meaning, is whether or not the United States has a role to play as a global policeman. And the answer to that question for me is an absolute no. I have little doubt that Ambassador Bolton and I actually share the same goal for the United States of America and the question of our foreign policy, which is to make the United States of America a stronger nation. But where I think we have some disagreements, and at times deep disagreements, is in the question of how we exactly do it. Let's start with just the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's the financial cost, $8 trillion on those two wars alone. That doesn't include other engagements in other parts of the world, including the recent Ukraine costs or other parts of the Middle East. That's at a moment where our national debt is $34 trillion. But it's not just the financial cost of those wars, of course. It's the human cost, including the cost to Americans themselves. Nearly 7,000 to 8,000 American lives lost. Human costs weren't persuasive enough about the folly of those wars. I would further add that the crisis in Europe, for those who care about the strength of our allies, the mass migration crisis in Europe today is actually in part a direct function of our failed intervention in the Middle East. What is a single example that we could point to where we've actually been successful in seeing that through? And I think the absence of a good answer to that question is a damning indictment of the foreign policy interventionism of the last 20 years. But to those who wouldn't find any of those arguments persuasive alone, let me leave you with one more, which is that this has distracted us from focusing on the ultimate national security threat that we actually do face, which we fail to confront, which is the rise of the Communist Party of China. There will be those who make the argument that this is apples and oranges, that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, again, I prefer to measure by the results. Right now, we're at the first time in modern American history in 2.5 decades where we don't have a carrier strike group in the Asia-Pacific region. And the reason why is we very recently sent the USS Lincoln to the Middle East. The last time we did it was in conjunction with our invasion of Afghanistan. We're $20 billion plus behind on military supplies supposed to be sent to Taiwan, at least a third of which were routed to Ukraine instead. We're talking about M1 Abrams tanks, we're talking about HIMARS, we're talking about Stingers, we're talking about coastal defense system. At least $6.7 billion of that $20 billion that would have gone to Taiwan has gone to Ukraine instead. We've actually strengthened inadvertently the Russia-China alliance since the Ukraine war began, which puts China in a stronger position relative to the United States, while the United States itself is in a weaker position vis-a-vis China. And when we think about that model of international diplomacy, since that too is part of the resolution, I do think that the multilateral institutional model of diplomacy has failed us, especially in the 21st century, through the UN, through the WTO, and other multilateral international institutions, by increasing our dependence on China. Yet today, 40% of the semiconductors that power the Department of Defense actually come from China. 95% of certain of our pharmaceuticals come from China. Most of our military industrial base depends on our chief adversary, China, and that was directly achieved by the model of international diplomacy that was mediated through these so-called multilateral international institutions that created a false equivalence between the United States and China, a false economic equivalence through the climate change agenda that was disproportionately applied to the United States without being applied to China, a false moral equivalence as trading relationships with China created an increased dependence on China for our modern way of life, but also companies like BlackRock or Nike or Airbnb or JP Morgan who relentlessly criticize the United States without saying a peep about the actual human rights atrocities in places like China. And that undermines our greatest geopolitical asset of all, which is not our nuclear arsenal, actually. It is our moral standing on the global stage. And that is in part a direct function of diluting our resources that have been misspent on wars in other parts of the world, especially in the 21st century, over the period of which China achieved near parity, if not military parity now, with the United States. But to learn from the mistakes of the past so that we may harness them to correct them in the future.
Right now, China is an active participant in the war in Ukraine. And the idea that you can split them apart is a fantasy. It is a growing axis that we need to worry about on a worldwide basis, and not simply to say we don't want to defend anything else in the world except maybe we'll defend Taiwan until that gets kind of dicey, and then we probably won't defend them. But what we need more than anything else in this country, which we do not have, and we do not have in the election campaign that we're going through now, are candidates that can say, here's our understanding of the threats that we face around the world and the burdens that we need to sustain to prevent those threats from becoming real. There are countries that realize that. Israel is a country like that, more threatened now than at any point in its history, yet more determined to make sure that it survives. We could learn a lot from them, and we could learn a lot from the vision of the framing of the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, who understood that a strong national defense is an absolute prerequisite to anything else we do. Thank you very much.